Analytic philosophy has become a rather equivocal term, especially in the last 30 years or so, when what we now call analytic philosophy really has very little to do in many cases with what analytic philosophy was in its beginning. In this course, we're going to focus on the historical dimension, analytic philosophy as a movement that began just at the turn of the century in the 1900s. So moving from the 18 into the 1900s. Nowadays, when you hear people refer to analytic philosophy, often they mean to contrast it with, say, continental philosophy or perhaps phenomenology or post-phenomenological philosophy. In that sense, analytic philosophy means little more than philosophy done by professors in universities in America and Britain and increasingly in some of the other European countries that has little or nothing to do with Hegel and things like that. And in this sense, analytic philosophy is all over the map. If you look at what's today called analytic philosophy, you'll find all kinds of stuff happening. So today, to be considered an analytic philosopher, you don't at all need to be a particular follower of, say, Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Moore. For our purposes, though, let's go back to when analytic philosophy was more of a unified movement. Now, it was never the case that all of the analytic philosophers agreed on some set of doctrines, but there are some general trends and ideas for a family resemblance that kind of groups all these analytic philosophers together. And in particular, analytic philosophy is in a large part what happens after Kant. Now, lots of things happen in philosophy after Kant. If you know about the history of modern philosophy, you know that Kant represents a kind of new phase of philosophy in many ways. Very, very important. Following Kant in the 1800s, so prior to analytic philosophy, we have German idealism, where Kant influenced a whole new generation of philosophers to develop his ideas, to try to systematize them a little bit more, to give them a more secure grounding. So the German idealists were very interested in trying to take what Kant did and make it better, improve upon it. Now, many people will tell you that the analytic philosophers are those who reject Kant and Hegel, but the picture is not near that clear-cut. In fact, in many ways, the analytic philosophers are very Kantian. They take up much of what the agenda that Kant set, and many of his ideas they stick with in particular ways. One of the big things that we need to understand about Kant is his division of the human intellect, the human faculties of reason, and what kinds of judgments the human being can make and what can legitimize those judgments. So Kant thought that there was a large set of judgments that the human being can make that only employ what he called pure concepts and that are legitimized solely by the structure of human understanding and human reason. Analytic philosophers will become very suspicious of that kind of claim. Analytic philosophers will, by and large, and this is too general and too simplistic, but just to get us some orientation, analytic philosophers will by and large argue that all of the claims that we can make that are necessarily true, that are a priori, that is independent of experience, those claims are restricted to logical claims. Put quite simply, the question that Kant and much philosophy in addition to Kant pursues is the question of the relation between mind and world. What makes it so that what happens in our brains can become knowledge, can have the significance of being about the external world, can be true or false with respect to the external world, and so on. So when we have a mental state, we don't take it to just be a bunch of subjective stuff happening in our own psychological spheres, cut off from everything else. We take it that the stuff coming into our mind and the thoughts we're having are somehow about the objective world out there. So how is it that our mental states can have that objective significance? This kind of shifts the register of philosophy from, say, questions about what the nature of God is, to questions with the following format. What must the nature of the human mind be such that it can comprehend a material reality outside of it? In a big way, Kant will lay the foundation for our modern view that really it's science that kind of figures out the nature of material reality. That's physics' job or that's biology's job. And really it's just faith that deals with God, philosophers have really nothing that they can say about, say, God and other religious topics. So he tries to delimit the scope of philosophy to make it more legitimate. So what must the human mind be like in order for it to make reference to the external world? Kant proposes that the concepts that we use whose role in judgment is to make claims about the way the world is, the state of actual reality, entails possession of concepts whose role in judgment make no such claims about the way the world is. These latter concepts, these pure concepts, are what give unity to our judgments and give those judgments the power to apply to objects of our cognition at all. But if these pure concepts are entailed by any of our use of empirical concepts, then they can't have come from empirical experience themselves. They must, Kant reasoned, be a priori. Kant denies Hume's idea that all cognitive content, all concepts, have to ultimately derive from sense impression. Moreover, since it's these very concepts that make it possible for our mental states to have objective significance, they must have their origin in the subject rather than in the object.